Welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I'm Bob Arnold, President here at DRJ. We thank you for your attendance today, and we hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. Everyone's phone has been muted, and we ask you to utilize the question panel you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen. Our speakers today will attempt to answer as many of these as possible at the end of today's session. Today's sponsor is Strategic BCP. Today's topic is In the Crosshairs, Evolving Compliance Challenges facing business continuity professionals. Our speakers today include Wayne Stadnick, Mark Eagleston, Denise Carlin, and Frank Perlmutter. Wayne is the Vice President of Continuity Risk Management in TCF National Bank and has over 20 years of business continuity and disaster recovery experience. Mark is the Security and BC Director at Health Partners Plan. He manages the plans and programs or policies development at HMO and providers organizations. Denise is the IT Compliance Program Director at Geisinger Health Plans. She has over 30 years in total quality management, GRC, process efficiency, and ISO certification. Frank, and our moderator today here, is the president and co-founder of Strategic BCP, creators of Resilience One BCM software. He has over 18 years experience in business continuity and risk management and is the former consultant with the Big Four Plus manager of DR BC Coop and risk manager for the U.S. Department of Treasury. With no further introductions, I'd like to turn the mic over to Frank.
Okay, great. All right, Bob. Thanks so much, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I want to thank our panel too. I'm real privileged today to be joined by three experts that I've known for a long time within the industry. Definitely, we have an excellent panel of compliance experts, business continuity, governance, risk and compliance, vendor assessment and management, and security professionals. So we've got an excellent panel that we hope can answer a lot of your questions, and we hope the content's real beneficial for you today. So you'll notice on the agenda what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going over a number of different topics today, but we want to definitely leave some time for your questions, and hopefully we can answer a lot of those. The first topic we're going to cover today is preparing for your audit or your examination. How do you do that? What are some tips and tricks that we've learned over the years when that auditor comes in, and how to best partner with them to have the best results from that particular audit or examination. What are some of the current compliance challenges we're facing today? So we're going to discuss a bit about some of the current standards that are coming out. It's actually interesting today. I just got a notification that four banks were fined aggregately $2.5 billion. So we're going to be discussing that too. What are some penalties for not complying, and how are you involved? How can you help support your audit and examination and not wind up in those types of positions, obviously? What are some strategies for long-term success? So how do we prepare ourselves to not only handle the initial ongoing audit and examinations and compliance, but what are some of the things that we see on the horizon? How do we set up a framework and a plan for successfully dealing with the challenges in the long term? And we've definitely seen a lot over the years, from changing regulations to new industries that are coming up with additional regulations, especially within the business continuity area, and also around governance, risk, and compliance. So there's definitely a lot to cover, and we're going to try to do that the best we can in the hour that we have with you this afternoon. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to get started with preparing for your audit and examination. So I'm going to hand this over to Wayne Stadnick right now. Wayne's going to start, and Mark, Denise, and I are going to comment on this slide here, and we're going to keep on passing the ball around a little bit through our presentation today.
Thanks, Frank. This is Wayne Stadnick, and before we get started, and I'm sure the rest of my esteemed colleagues will join in with their comments on this as well, but my comments regarding the presentation you're going to see today are my comments only. They are not necessarily reflective of TCF National Bank. And now that I got the legalese out of the way, as we all sit and go through these examinations, and I'm sure everybody in our audience today has realized this, that the audit, the examination, whatever you choose to call it, has transformed itself over the past 10 years especially. The catalyst for this was, for those of us in the financial industry, was the economic crisis that began in about 2008. Because no longer are your examiners just coming in and doing those simple little checklists to make sure that your you have a business continuity plan. One has been updated on a frequent basis. It contains the very basic things. These guys have gotten a lot smarter. The regulatory agencies are extracting professionals with significant experience out of the business world and putting them to work to conduct examinations. So those may have been your peers are now your examiners, and they understand the game that you're up against. So as we go through this particular presentation, like Frank mentioned, we'll talk about some ways to prepare yourself. But one of the biggest things to keep in mind is that awareness that the examiners have gotten smarter. You're under a greater scrutiny all the time to perform, protect your organization and its various employees, stockholders, shareholders, and whatever else you may have through these various types of audits. The best way for you to do these kind of things is to understand what the regulations are. And then Frank is going to have a little bit of an update for the team on this in just a little bit later regarding the various types of regulations and standards that seem to be on an ever-evolving basis going on. But in order to keep yourselves out of the hot water, like Frank was just talking about with those 4 banks that received penalties today, a lot of this onus is on you. Business continuity is becoming more and more of an ingrained operation within organizations, and especially within the financial industries. It is a critical process that is looked at and looked at quite deeply by your examiners. I'm sure none of this is any revelation to those of you who are in this particular industry, as those of us who survive these particular audits, what seem to be on a more continual basis, are driving a much deeper need for the business continuity practitioner to understand what it is an examination could entail. Right off the bat, if you take a look under the subpoints under the first bullet there, you've got to understand what kind of an audit you're up against. Is it a SOC 1 or a SOC 2? Are you being done as a service agency instead, getting an SSAE 16? We'll talk about the various types of audits that go on in just a few slides here. But these are the things you need to be aware of to help set your stage so that you can respond to those kinds of questions, as they're going to show up more and more in your world every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's some great points. I mean, it's definitely, as things are evolving, you notice on here an established internal framework to measure against is essential. It's hard to keep up and everything. Mark, Denise, actually, why don't we start with Mark, since we're actually all in different locations right now. So I'll create some order on here. Mark, what do you think about the evolution of some of these standards within healthcare, and also too how security has kind of overlapped into the business continuity too, since you're handling both at Health Partners?
Sure. Well, I tell folks all the time, it's a great time to be in IT, great time to be in healthcare, great time to be in security. If you've got all 3 rolled up into one, such as myself, well, it's just absolutely fantastic. So never a loss of opportunities. But as we commented on this slide, Frank, it's important to know there's difference between the SOC 1 and SOC 2. Gone are the days of people doing more of the SOC 1s, and I'm seeing more in my area, IT security, of the SOC 2. And the reason being is those are the ones that are the IT type. Within that SOC 2 audit, you're going to have business continuity, security, integrity, availability, and even privacy. So you're getting attestations of those type of areas. Of course, it's also important to understand the difference between a type of an audit. A type 1 is basically, dump your policies on me. Let's see if you have a framework. But the ones that we're asking for more and more and maturing to is, you figured it, type 2. And that's when you're actually getting proof and attestation that the policies are being followed. A lot of people describe those as kind of the validation of a period of time, a snapshot, if you will. But certainly having an internal framework to measure against all of this is important. You don't want to redo your audit response with every, Tom, Dick, and Harry, or internal auditor, external auditor, and compliance auditor, if you will. It's important that if you have a matrix of what all the applicable regulations, standards, et cetera, are to you, and build a library, you're going to be able to better respond, more efficiently respond, and better yet, show some maturation with your program and continually refine your responses. So, yeah, it's a great time.
Excellent. And Denise, I know, it's interesting. We were actually talking about the difference even in between of the different auditors and examiners, where one may say one thing and another may say something else. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So as we all know, and it was mentioned earlier, we have a lot of audits that hit our plates. If it's not the OIG putting out new information about audits and making sure that they're risk-based, or CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, you have insurance departments, you have financial institutions. If you are a service organization, and whether you supply software or you're a business process outsourcer, every one of your clients is going to want to look at your audits. So making sure that who your auditors are is very important. So again, I should go back to what Wayne said about my stance, and what I say is my opinion and not that of Geisinger's. So we will make that clear. But I've been in a lot of industries, starting in manufacturing and printing, telecom, banking, and now I'm in healthcare. And I've seen the different levels of the folks that come to audit you. And, a lot of times they're younger, nothing wrong with that, but sometimes their skill set may not be there. So an example might be an auditor is going to tell you that, oh, this is good, your business continuity plan is really good, and you have your binder. But maybe somebody's going to your management saying, you know what, I think we need to do more. So again, it's good to know your auditors. Of course, the firms are reputational, their reputation alone can help you there. But make sure that you're really in good tune with your auditor. Make sure you're on the same page, because we don't want to give our management a scare and say, hey, I don't think we're ready, and then have the auditor come and say, oh no, you're good. And you don't want management to have a false sense of security. So in either instance, you need to make sure you're stating the facts, and you also need to make sure that the auditors are actually giving the proper information to your management.
Right.
And again, based on industry, based on the different levels of the auditor skill sets you're working with, you need to be there to try to paint the truest picture you can, so your executive staff can assess the risk and then determine what their risk appetite and acceptance is.
That's right. Yeah, it's interesting, that you mentioned that. There's the different types of auditors and the different types of audits. There used to be one, and I think we've all been through this, of where you had the checklist audit, and what the auditor would do is they would go through, they'd grab the table of contents from a plan and go, got it. And those were the I don't know what you'd want to call that. I don't know if I'd call that the good old days, because it was a very obviously flimsy audit and how those were going on, but it was a lot easier definitively to get through that. But now they're really looking at the data. They're looking at different items within the particular plans and saying, are these things actually going to work? And that actually leads into our next slide, where, there's different areas that they're looking for now. It's going way beyond the plan binder and the table of contents that says, hey, I have my BIA and my crisis management plan and my business recovery plan and, all the different, the elements that quote unquote make up a compliant plan. These things are not or hadn't been typical, and now they have been for a number of years and are becoming even more important. So Wayne, why don't you talk a little bit about some of these on here?
Thanks, Frank. As you can see on this slide, everybody, your audit is not just going to be like Frank talked about. What do you have in your binder today? Those days, call them the good old days, are gone. Let's be serious about this now. The examiners have gotten, like I said earlier, a lot smarter on this. They're going to take a look at what you've done. Within our organization itself, we've identified over 1,700 different business processes that we've mapped out. Obviously, those business processes are interrelated. So the examiners have shown, at least in the financial industries in the recent years, a great interest in how your business processes are linked so that you're not looking at your continuity plans or your recovery strategies in a particular silo. Because if you're dependent upon someone for a bit of information, I can pretty much guarantee you that there's somebody else within your organization that's waiting on you for some type of a bit of information. That's the analysis they want to see that you're actually mapping through to make sure you understand what it is that business process or where the single points of failure within that particular business process actually are. So it behooves you to understand where people are dependent upon others and who is depending upon them in that data stream. None of this is going to be a revelation for anybody who's been in this business for a particular, any particular length of time, but the examiners are starting to show a much greater level of detailed interest in how you're doing that analysis. And then right along with that second point, the data collection method. How are you actually going out there and doing your data collection in order to produce these strategies, reports, these analyses that you're doing? If you're just quite simply going out there with the old-fashioned Excel spreadsheet and the small Q&A process, I can tell you if you're in the financial industry, you're going to have issues with that. They are looking for, one, skilled professionals to be able to actually conduct these interviews with the various business partners out there, and a solid methodology, including challenges, because there's very few people out there who are going to tell you that their business process is not critical. Otherwise, they're probably dooming themselves in some way, shape, or form. So you're going to receive, as I'm sure many of you have out there, some rather inflated time frames. Oh, I must have my process recovered within 1 hour and I can't lose a single bit of data. Well, we know that all organizations do not have 100% critical business operations, but people will tend to do that in order to protect themselves, because nobody wants to be considered an optional type of a process within an organization. So your data collection method has to include a good challenge process along with that. And that leads into the third bullet point of the analysis. When you are looking through all these various bits of data that you have extracted from that nice solid collection process that you built earlier, you have to have what is known as a challengeable credit on these particular processes so that you can go back and say, Wayne, is it really true that the most important function within your area is making coffee every day and that the company will come to a screeching halt if you don't do that? If you don't have some form of a credible challenge out there built within your process that you can demonstrate, and that's leading into the fourth point, demonstrated and documented process of these things. Me simply offering up my opinion at a particular point during an interview is not going to withstand scrutiny from any type of an organized audit. Examiners today are looking for that heavy documentation, and it's on your shoulders as the BCP professional out there to be able to produce that solid methodology, that solid analysis method, and the documentation to support all of those things that you've done along with this process.
Yep. I think Mark had a point too that he wanted to mention.
Sure. I actually just wanted to go back really quickly to a point you made, Frank. You talked about the good old days. I think I know what those good old days are called. They're referred to as checkbox compliance, and you're absolutely right. They are long gone. In fact, if you don't mind, I'd like to read a brief quote. This is from Jim Ralph, who is Aetna CISO, our Chief Information Security Official. He simply states that if you have an information security program that satisfies all the regulatory requirements, that is like the first level of maturity you want to achieve, but it's not at all ineffective from a risk management standpoint to support the needs of protecting customer information. So, an end quote. So you can see from right there, that's really been an uptick in how compliance officials, security officials, and business continuity leaders are beginning to think. You don't want to base your program just on compliance. That's a great foundation, but it is not any way to mature your program and to stay ahead of the curve. So if you look at the slide there aren't a whole lot of regulations that are asking about vendor management, but there certainly is a ton of people that are going in that direction because it's such a huge risk area. Who are you sharing your data with? What encryption controls are you using? What role-based access are you using? All those type of things. You could probably draw from regulations to support your investigation in those areas, but getting your business leads to document those type of things and help come up with a process can really help you out as a professional. Enterprise risk management, or ERM, that's been a huge focus as well. And there's lots of documents out there, especially the NIST, National Institute of Standard Technology 800 series, numerous documents on there, and they're a great way for the federal government to spend your tax dollars. They really are some wonderful, quote-unquote, free documents. Also, for those of you who do insurance, there's a thing called ORSA, or Own Risk Solvency. And Own Risk Solvency Assessment is just taking enterprise risk management to the next level. And remember, that all started off with something called risk analysis a couple years ago. So those risk pieces are really becoming more and more prevalent, and there's not going to be a lack of documentation of standards, but that's not really where you want to end up. You want to really embody what the intent of the rules are and see how you can mature it and be more than prepared for your next audit.
And Mark, I agree. This is Denise again. And to the last bullet and the sub-bullets that Mark was talking about, we see that every day when we're dealing with assets that are coming in from a compliance perspective, security and risk perspective. But we don't need to just have our vendor management list. We need to make sure that all of our vendors have their compliance in order, every downstream vendor. So my one vendor is an ASP, and they have my data, but then they subcontract out to another vendor, and so on and so on. So we all know how data can persist. So we need to be very, very conscious of how we handle our risk management. And how do we deal with that? Maybe we need to start, and this is everyone, nationally even, because of the risk base, we should probably start reviewing our vendor agreements and seeing, hey, are we going to be covered? If I can't get any product because of a flood, any kind of a natural disaster, who can I go to get that? So vendor management, there are a couple things. Will my vendor really treat me like I'm special when there's an event? Or will they make sure my data is secure as they're constantly using it and working with other vendors? They're all risk related. Enterprise risk, operational risk management. Again, to get back to that checklist topic, business continuity was always the checklist, but because of all the risks now, we see it in the news every day, we have to steer away from that. So even the term business continuity, that sort of implies that checklist. If we start thinking more along the lines of business resiliency, so, how do we keep the business going? Let's look at our risks. Are we looking at risks that are low risks? Where are we spending our time? We all have, like I said, audits go across the whole year just about now, and they're cutting our resources, so we don't have time. So are we spending our time wisely? Should we look at every single log we have in-house? No, that's a low risk. Only look at the high-risk logs, or logs that are really important and meaningful to us. Change management, to go back to the SOC 1, SOC 2, where you have IT integrity. You need to make sure that there's a segregation of duties for your change management, and you don't have John Doe slipping that extra 1/100th of a cent of every transaction into his Grand Cayman account. Something like that. Those are things that you really need to look at. Unfortunately, I was involved when I worked for an ASP with an embezzlement case, and my company was accused of that. Thank God our controls were in place, and we were able to prove that it wasn't us, and in turn, it was someone at the company's site, our client's site. So again, if we just remember for audits and change management, risk, vendor management, that we need to have some kind of a compliance. We need to make sure that we address the highest risks first. And if we do that, that will get us at least going in the right direction.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, when you say, when we look at all these items on here too, it's interesting. This is all about preparedness. We call this there's the before and the after. The before is what can you do before you have to use your plans. The plans are the after, after something happens. So when you're looking at it, there's quite a bit of a focus involved now in the prevention of these actual events and disasters, and they never used to assess that before. That never used to be, this big focus. It was always like, well, what's in your plan and how you recover and everything. And then the other thing is, too, is, as Wayne mentioned, when you look at data collection and data analysis, it's interesting, and we've for any of you that have ever attended any of our other webinars, it's, the big thing is, if your data collection method is the asking method, hey, what do you think? It's very flimsy when it goes to the auditors, when it goes to the executives. It doesn't work well. What do you think your RTO is? What do you think you need? You have to base it on fact. And analysis has to involve basically synthesizing that data. You need to group it and then making the logical conclusions out of that. So those methods are really being criticized. Banking particularly has been really criticizing those particular areas, especially with recovery timeframe objectives and the BIA method. The ways that, the survey methods that used to work in the past are just not cutting it. Those series of questions with, saying, well, that's what Bob Smith, the controller, said, doesn't work so well anymore. I don't want opinions. I want collective facts. I want objective impacts. I don't want subjective, I think that, name that tune kind of BIAs. Yeah, I can, I think it should be 3 days. Why? Because I'm the CEO. It doesn't fly. Doesn't matter who it is. So I think that's becoming really, we can see that's becoming really big. And I think Wayne had a comment too on the vendor management, especially. That's a major hot topic.
So,
I did, Franken.
Oh, go ahead, Wayne. Sorry.
Oops. I did, Frank, and we can talk about that a little bit later when we talk to standards, but I want to bring the awareness to the group now. For those of you in the financial industry, the FFIEC released new business continuity handbook for guidance in February of this year, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit here. But a very key point in there is the vendor management thing, and I'd encourage you all highly to read it. Denise, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I noted that there was a question, and the question is, what are some examples of ways to demonstrate our ability to challenge criticality claims, and how do we document that properly? Well, one thing that I can't answer is exactly how to break out the criticality of claims. However, of course, if, it could be, some claims can be life-threatening, I'm sure, or, ways to get claims approved. So if your systems are down, you definitely have to make sure you address those. So I would suggest the business area, you need to sit down and help the business area talk through those. If you're not the expert, they are. So ask them the questions. If this claim isn't addressed now because we're down, what's the impact? What impact is going to be felt? So anytime there's any kind of event, the first thing you need to do is ask yourself, what's the impact? So there are going to be claims that need to be addressed immediately, or, prior authorizations that you can't let those wait, or, prescriptions that need to be refilled. Somebody can't wait if your system's down. So you need to have those things documented and addressed. And again, not being the expert in that particular field, but the expert in leading people to the right answers, you need to really sit down and help the business determine how to break out the criticality of those claims.
Right. Yeah, I think that they also mean, too, it's interesting because healthcare claims kind of has a dual meaning, the claims process, but people claiming, too, that I guess there's a bad business continuity joke for you, the claims of the claims. But when you look at that, when somebody is asserting, their RTO and says, I am the most critical, I no ifs, ands, or buts about it, I should be the first thing that you hand on there. It's very interesting. How do you go up against somebody? You don't want to tell them that they're not important. But what you want to do is this is, you're recovering your organization or a facility or, at least some sort of a large grouping of activities. You can't recover everything. And the biggest thing is you want to align that with different, like Denise said, different impacts. So let me ask you something. So what's important? Typically you're starting off that business impact analysis with, with your steering team. What's important to the company? What's important to the organization? Well, loss of revenue, public image, those kind of things. So let me ask you something. And Wayne mentioned making coffee. So if you don't make coffee, and say you're not, Dunkin' Donuts or something or Starbucks, if you don't make coffee today, what's the revenue impact for doing that? Well, I don't really have a revenue impact. Okay. And are people really going to hear that you didn't do that today? What's the impact to public image? Well, they're not really going to hear about that either. So it has to be done in that method. And in the end, you don't want to say to them, bluntly, hey, you don't matter. But what you're doing is you say, with the criteria that the steering team have set, this is how it lays out right here. And it's an objective way of doing things. We can't recover everything. We can only recover a certain number of those activities. So it's important that that be done right for the sake of everybody at the organization.
Frank, this is Mark. We also have that RTO, or recovery time frame objective inflation here. And even our software rates things as critical or necessary functions. So in order to try and level set expectations, we actually do just what you said. You do that little mini BIA or business impact analysis on those factors you spoke of. But in the end, it really just matters about, if you don't do this function, is that going to impact our solvency? That's what it comes down to. And then you'll have a lot of kind of deer in the headlight looks, but you at least then can begin discussion of being able to more quantify those impacts.
Yep. Okay. So the next thing that we're going to discuss are some key items to address before the exam. So how do you get prepared? So I know Wayne and Denise and Mark are definitely going to comment on these on here. So some 4 points on here to review. So go ahead, Wayne.
Thanks, Frank. And I'll try and keep this thing brief and honor our time commitments to everybody out there. Folks, if you are in this industry, you're going to be subject to an examination at some point in time. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is that cycle is increasing. It's not becoming your typical annual once-a-year examination, every other year, every 3 years. It's now becoming a constant barrage, and these examinations are coming from all directions. They'll be your federal regulators, your state regulators, various types of bodies, including your internal audiences, as well as those partners that you may be forming up with. So it behooves you to understand and address certain items before your exam and make this part of your operational process so that it becomes ingrained into your thinking so that you're not trying to build something specific for each type of an examination. But before you reach one of those examinations or inquiry periods, you've got to know what the scope is. If you can, meet with your examiner, understand and establish what the scope will be. It's for all lines of business. It's for one particular line of business. The period under examination is this year, last year, and this year. Establish those types of things as well as those types of bodies, as you can see there, that under the first, second, or third parties, that is going to be performing the examination. Because once you know that, you can move on to the second step, which is what standards and regulations are they going to be using to examine you. In the financial industry, the primary one that's used is the BCP workbook issued by the FFIEC. There's also COBIT that's used from an audit perspective on those things. They're going to cover most of them, but if your particular examiner from step number 1 has a particular bent that they're looking to focus on, you should be aware of what it is they're going to be looking at. If they're a particular provider to you or wanting to be a partner, they're going to have a different perspective than your typical internal audit type of an exam.
Yep.
Lastly, on this slide, there are a lot of references out there in the industry. Go Google them. Download those standards. They're available. They're free. Those regulatory books are available for you. Download them. Practice against yourself. Answer the quick questions and give yourself the quick question and the answer test. Did we do this? Can we perform this? How would I answer this question? Anybody else want to chime in on this one?
No, I think the one big thing is too, not some of those are free. The FFIEC BCP work program is free, but there are actually some other ones that you do have to pay for. So on there, so but those are definitely, there's a lot of discussions. Yeah, the ISO standards you definitely have to pay for on the back end, but that's important too. You know, it's important to know some of those different resources, but the FFIEC BCP work program, and Wayne, correct me if I'm wrong here, that has it actually has the actual workbook on the back end of it. Like you could literally fill that, if that's in, I think it's in PDF, but it doesn't mean you can't write it down or translate that into Word, and that's a good dry run, right?
You are correct, Frank. The second half of the FFIEC workbook for you, those of you in the financial industry, actually includes about 30 different pages of questions they will be asking you. It provides you a great starting point to know where, 1, to evaluate your program for compliance, and 2, how you might end up as part of the exam.
Yeah, that's actually a really good workbook for anybody too. Inside or outside of banking, it's very good.
It's a good standard.
Yeah, and I was going to state the same thing. The only other thing, in healthcare, we have to make sure we're, you know, whether you're with CMS or JCAHO for hospital side, we just have to make sure all of the standards that are particular to your industry are addressed. But again, the financial industry one is probably the strongest, so that's always good to go to.
And on this next slide, you know, what are other ways that you can partner with your examiner? Wayne will go through this briefly.
Thanks, Frank. This is pretty straightforward, folks. Talk to your examiners, understand what it is. The more you can talk to them and understand what they're going to be using and what the scope of the audit is, the better chance you've got of surviving it is. Also, and this is particularly prevalent in the financial industry, if you have a process that self-identifies any issues before the examiner finds them, and that you have a project plan that you're mapping against to close that particular issue, the examiners have really, I've noticed in the past couple of years, really embraced that. It doesn't say that it necessarily has to be done, it has to be complete, but that you have identified an issue and you are actively managing the closure of it. And keep in mind, when you're sitting in the exam, you have to answer those questions. And I know this next bullet point seems passé, but time and time again throughout my career I have seen this happen. Do not lie to your examiners. You will get caught at some point in time. Like I mentioned at the onset, these guys have gotten a lot smarter. They can be your friend, but remember, they are still an examiner on there. So if you're looking to get funding or drive a particular issue that you've been struggling with, your examiner can be your ally. But don't bite the hand that feeds you, folks. Don't put yourself in a position where you're offering up your organization to a situation that an examiner may or may not know of just to get something moving in your program.
Thank you, Wayne. One thing I would like to add is under the first bullet where you have examiners like you to self-identify or at least have a corrective plan in place. So a lot of people have been asking me, especially recently with a lot of the changes, listen, all these things are being applied to us from regulatory bodies, and there's no way we can have this done or be done in 6 months or a year or even 2 years. So that's where these corrective action plans come into place. So I'm coming in and I'm your auditor, and I say, well, it's only been 6 months since this regulation is in place. Let me see your evidence. And if you can show them that, well, you don't have this in place, but you can show them that in good faith you are putting this into practice, then that definitely comes off as a good finding because you're being proactive. If the auditor just sees nothing and you just say, well, it's only been 6 months, what do you expect? I can't work miracles. And I've actually, again, to the point of where you're not supposed to lie, I've seen people take that kind of a stance with an auditor too. Let me tell you, you don't win friends or allies with your auditors if you come across very defensive like that. All of these findings that they find, if we can think of those as opportunities to improve instead of, oh, another problem, then I think you'll all be better off. So if we can just change that mindset to, again, make our business more resilient, make it better, then I think we'll all be at a lesser stress level throughout the day.
Well, hopefully that sounds good. Yeah, it's true. It's worrying and being defensive versus being proactive and looking at it as a partnership is definitely a good way, I think, to move things forward. And like I said, it's interesting because I know that just from being on both sides of it, both being, both doing examinations and then also being examined. I mean, you definitely see it makes sense to have that, that friendly partnership going on. So for the next section on compliance landscape and the different things out there, Mark is actually gonna lead this off. So I'm gonna go into the next slide, and Mark, you can take it away.
Thanks, Frank. So on this piece there, I mean, we kind of wanted to dedicate a little bit of time at just talking about what's hot. It's tough to see who our audience is today, but I don't know if it really matters across the verticals. Certainly in healthcare IT, there's a whole lot of things coming out between meaningful use, between cybersecurity regs, but they're really impacting more than just healthcare. So let's start with the cybersecurity piece. There's been a lot of talk at the federal level to actually change some laws and introduce new laws about it, and they really go across 3 different areas. There's the area of information sharing. Basically, you've heard of ISACs, or Information Sharing Accountability Organizations, and these organizations are here to share the information and indicators of compromise, or IOCs, and that's really helpful so that when one entity starts to get hacked, they can share that information with other entities. That's coming out. And what is business continuity doing to help IT departments respond to those regulations and to help out their fellow organizations? The cybersecurity legislation also is impacting local law enforcement by hoping to give them more resources so that they can effectively combat cybersecurity. And last but certainly not least, the federal legislation aims to do a little bit more baselining of the national breach response. To those multinational organizations in attendance today, you're no stranger to trying to comply with all the various privacy and security laws across states, and if you're in the European Union, you even have a whole other matter of privacy concerns to be concerned about. So the national breach stuff is going to help us stateside and make sure that you're more aware of what type of breaches you'll need to be responding to. As we mentioned before, third-party risk management. I'm not seeing a lot of legislation in that, but I do believe it's only going to be a matter of time. Some vendors are becoming much more, I guess, knee-jerk reactive to certain items as well, and that's what you really want to stay away from if you're building an effective compliance program. For example, the Anthem breach, which impacted 80 million folks not too long ago, earlier this year. NAIC, or National Association of Insurance Commissioners, are now proposing their own regulatory standard or compliance framework to help people get compliance with security. So you're seeing this more. And then folks like Anthem actually refused some state audits early on. So they got some bad press with that too. Now largely they're going to rebound from that like a lot of other breach vendors, but the public's going to continue to get less and less tolerant of breaches of their private information. So there's lots of stuff there. Denise, did you want to add anything?
Well, just to your last topic, so our vendors and our customers are sending risk assessments to a security risk assessments or just their annual request for renewal. And over the years, we've seen their questions become more mature as they go. So, of course, when you first started out, we first started out years ago, pretty much the questions were like, hey, do you take care of my data? Okay, good. Now you have sometimes pages and pages of questions, and they're not all security related, but the majority of them are data and security related. So some of the small companies don't have the expertise to do that, so they're hiring organizations now. There's like the Aon Hewitts and companies out there that actually job themselves out to do these risk and security assessments for companies. And so we need to make sure that everybody can handle those. And if you're not at that stage, then you should really start taking a look at that.
Yeah, it's very interesting too. There was we had a question come through that I think has a very clear answer. Should customers expect them to present their audit results, as publicly, or at least to the customer of that service? Absolutely. That's what an attestation is. It is, where a third-party auditor goes in and takes a look and says what they think about the controls, about, what's being done internally from, business continuity, security, operationally, and they assess that. So good companies will typically have that done. And as I mentioned before, Type 1 and Type 2. Type 1, you list out all of, what you do. Type 2, they actually test it to make sure that you've actually done what they say you're going to do. The interesting part about vendor management now is how many levels do you go down? Is it the vendor of the vendor of the vendor of the vendor? And the answer is within some of the regs, especially in financial services, we're being asked this a lot. They go down 2 levels, sometimes 3 levels. So it's very interesting. It's like how many is enough levels? I don't think that's been, n to the how many degree. We don't know that yet. Reasonable, we have seen 2. In rare cases, we've seen where it's the vendor of the vendor of the vendor. So it has been that 3 on there too. And when we're looking at vendor risk management, the one interesting thing is, that's something that my company does. When we go out and when we assess plans, I'm sorry, I said that completely wrong. We assess business continuity programs, okay? It was plans. So now the focus has really moved off of, what's in the plan to an actual demonstrated capability to recover. I wonder if we'll get an acronym out of that. So, and how do you show that? They take key business functions that particular organization performs for them, and they say, show us that your folks can actually recover in our stated service level agreement, i.e. also known as recovery timeframe. So that's big, real big right now. And they don't do a lot, but if you imagine that, just to show that, that shows the efficacy of the plans themselves. Plans don't equal recoverability. It's the actual, showing that, the exercises and showing those things. Okay, so moving on to the next slide on here, and there's quite a bit on here, and these slides will be available along with the presentation a bit later on too. What you can see is there are a number of standards, regulations, best practices. I cannot fit them all on the slide. We've combined a couple of those together. You can see, the ISO, the 22301 that we're familiar with, some of the new ones, the 17 and the 318 on the business impact analysis and supply chain. As Wayne mentioned, the FFIEC, the new release on that. The CMS emergency preparedness requirements that are now a rule, which is causing considerable I don't know the right word on there, attention to be brought to it in the healthcare industry in recoverability and standards for that. Things that we haven't seen before are definitely really quite prevalent. The people that haven't had to necessarily comply with stringent standards like in healthcare because of all the different changes, are really, it's becoming quite a bit more challenging to do that. So definitely, obviously this is not in any way, shape, or form an exhaustive list, hence the plus many, and however many as we can fit in here more on there. There's actually a great list on the DRJ website that you can download too of all those standards. Okay, so a bit about the difference in between regulations and standards. One of the biggest things is that so with so many standards out there, just like with business functions and recovering, you have to smartly pick which of these regs, standards, and best practices you're going to pick. So I'm going to ask actually Mark and Wayne to briefly comment on this. The difference in between regs and standards and best practices. Talk a little bit about that. Why don't we start with Wayne?
Thanks, Frank. This slide is a great slide, folks. Read it and understand it. Regulations are things that you must adhere to. Standards and best practices are nice things to adhere to. Don't get caught chasing the standard of the week. As Frank just listed on the previous slide, there's a new one all the time. It's being updated. So there are good things in those standards and best practices, but what you're actually accountable for is adherence to those regulations. And it behooves you as the BCP professional to understand what the relevant regulations are for your organizations. As Frank mentioned, there's a great resource on the DRJ website that lists a comprehensive amount across a lot of different industries that you can use for your reference. And in respect of the time commitment here, I'm just going to turn it over to Mark Fast.
To echo that comment and hopefully get some questions, it's back to you, Frank.
Okay. How about Denise? Denise, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, the only thing I have from being in different industries and the previous slide showing all those different regulations, especially if you have multiple states regulations as well, if you steer towards best practice and if you do things the right way, hopefully it would be more meaningful to you as a program. So for instance, you're building out your continuity program. You're also going to have your SOPs in there and a lot of other things that are important, and they'll add value to your plan or your program. But again, are we really going to try to keep up with all these regulatory changes? So if you really just try to keep best practice in mind, and of course, you need to know these guidelines or be familiar with them, I think that will just help you stay a step ahead of any new regulations that come along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have to, and they may want to. It's a real heavy differentiation on there. If I have to do it, I'm going to do it. If I can do it, I'm probably not going to do it. I got a lot to do that I have to do. So, it's interesting, and a lot of people, I think, view it that way. It's nice to have a ton of time, but and to do everything, but you know what? I think the big thing is, you need to keep what's in front of you that's mandatory, what you have to do, and deal with that first. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. There's definitely a differentiation between compliance and resilience, and this has been this has definitely been a source of a bit of ire, I think, within the industry, and definitely confusion too. Resilient planning, which is something that you can actually use, and as I mentioned before, people want to see exercises, like proven capability, not that binder on there. So it's almost two sets of approaches sometimes, and a lot of times what's in the standards and the regs and the best practices aren't necessarily considered by a lot of actually a lot of clients or even your vendors or your customers as being the correct approach. So but you have to do it. So, you're going to get audited. You're going to get examined. You're going to have those different things on there. Some people actually have the two sets of books approach. So what is that? Not like the accounting approach, the illegal one, but where you're actually, I have a very thin plan that shows my resilience. I have a set of procedures that people are trained in. They don't necessarily need that, but it's good as a reference. And then I have another one that's the big, that big binder where you can show each and every point of compliance in there. You can show the process. You can show each of the different elements in there. So that's the big thing. So really, when you're looking at establishing, what do you use to be the most efficient at your organization? One of the things that we've done is we've actually combined together standards, regulations, and best practices to have a planning framework. And a lot of people have done this. Ours is called the Genome Framework that has been around for a number of different years. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, mostly for the purposes of just how you could build your own and give you some tips for success on how we did it. When you look at the strategies for long-term success, a framework is definitely a part of that. The big thing is, as Wayne mentioned before, watch out for jumping on the hot standard. So for those of, for the panel, and we've definitely been around a while, we have seen, what's hot today? Well, hey, that's 1600. Oh, wait, no, wait, BS 25999. Wait, hold on one sec. It's PS Prep. Wait, no, hold on. ISO 22301, they changed. They all had validity. They all had backing from major organizations. There are definitely some differences. It really, the big thing about all of these on here was that voluntary standards too. So keep in mind voluntary standards. So that's a big thing. It creates a moving target for you. So the big thing about this, when you're looking at establishing compliance, don't hop on one of these because chances are it's going to change in a couple of years. You can definitely use this and that other list to build a good framework though. So like ISO 22301 is good on governance, audit sections. Maybe you're going in and you're looking at FFIEC for things like the BIA, business recovery. You're looking at NIST for some of that different risk management and information technology. You're looking at NFPA 1600 for crisis management. So each of those different elements combined together can really help out quite a bit. Any of the panelists want to mention anything on that? No?
Just
Okay.
a repeat of what was stated below, and then again, just make sure you weigh all your factors and make sure that if you do a risk-based approach, that you're not spending more than what will come back in return.
Yep, absolutely. Here's a bit on here, and I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this completely, but the big thing was we basically synthesized the standards together. And what we saw was there's actually quite a bit of redundancy among the standard, and when I say standards, I mean everything, best practices and regulations too. So I'm using that word collectively on there. So it helps us guide when we build our software, that really helps us. And so for you, whether you're using a software package or using Excel or or Word or whatever it may be, utilizing those standards together to build a consistent framework is a really great way to do something. And what you can see on here too is that the frameworks generally went around 8 categories. So when you're looking and you're saying, what should I have in my particular program to meet compliance, and also too to have a resilient program, you can see here too some of these areas are really important. There's a lot that focus, and we call this there's like the bread of the sandwich and the meat. The bread is section 1, the bread is section 7, and the bread is section 8. So standards like ISO 22301, they're real good bread standards on there. And there's some that are real good meat standards. They show you how to do some of these things. They don't want to give you too much guidance because they want to give you the flexibility to do it how you want. As you know, it could be good and bad. You want the how too, but they don't want to tell you too much. So you can see that's a double-edged sword right there. So you can see those are some of the major categories that you want to handle when you're doing that. Okay, so with that, what we're going to do, Bob is going to just put some questions in here, and we're going to answer them in the couple minutes we have left.
Yes, and while he's reading a couple of the questions here, again, any questions for the panel or Frank, again, can be entered in the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll get to it, as many as we can get to. If we don't get to them, they will have access to these, and we'll follow up with you afterwards directly. So.
Yeah, what we're going to do too is we have several work groups that we post to. Some of the LinkedIn groups that we have. So if it's industry specific, we'll post it up there. And if it's more general, there are a number of different groups. And if you're not a part of one of those, we're going to actually what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to post our email addresses. So if there's something that you'd like to ask all of us or one of us, we can do that too. And I believe a number of myself and several of the panelists are going to be at DRJ too. So there's a number of different opportunities. Okay, so let's see here.
Frank, did you want me to chime in on the first one?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sounds good.
So the first question reads, how do you collect BIA with recovery times based on data? How do you ask the right questions to get that kind of data? So I'll go ahead and share my, I'm not a big fan of BIAs being a separate document. I know the old school approach is hand out a survey and ask people to rate their functions. And as we kind of alluded to earlier, guess what? You already know the answers. Everybody's going to say their functions are critical and necessary. I think it's better to go back and ask some of those questions that Frank was referring to. Like, what is a reputational harm if you don't make coffee? What is the expected revenue loss if your coffee isn't out in the first 24 hours, first 2 days, first 3 days? Asking those type of questions kind of bakes in that business impact analysis, quantitative, qualitative results. Then you're left with a much better RTO and some notes to validate that. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, there's definitely too. We have entire presentations that several of us have actually, some of us and some other folks have given together. There's the playbook series, which describes a bit, and we also have presentations too on, doing BIAs from start to finish. There's actually another BIA question that says, you keep mentioning BIA. I'm assuming you're referring to a business BIA. I have heard of some doing a technical BIA, which I believe that's extra work. That's not required. The business BIA should drive technology. What is your opinion? I couldn't agree more. I think that, if you're not selling technology, technology in most companies is used to support the business. So you recover those different business functions that are most critical and the technology that supports them. So shouldn't the technology really follow the requirements of the business? That is, and like I say, that I know that everybody's mentioned that we're just expressing our opinions and not the opinions of the company. That is the opinion of my company too. It should be that way. The other way, you can definitely do what's called an application impact analysis, but typically that's more of the data is fed from the business into that AIA. So it even has a different name by a lot of people. Of course, there's a lot of jargon in BCP, but typically that's the way that we see it, and that's the way we believe it should be done.
So I don't know if we have time, but one more question. How transparent are auditors willing to be in disclosing in advance what scope of operations will be included in an upcoming audit? I've never had an issue with that. Auditors know I need to have that piece of information in order to give them the proper artifacts and evidence that they need. So I've never had that be a problem. In fact, we always did that even for trying to do our workload forecasting. They knew what was involved, so I knew what resources needed to be available.
And I second Denise's comments on that. In fact, you'll find a greater partnership if you start asking that in advance, because it makes both of your lives easier.
Yep.
Agreed.
Okay. All right. I think we had one more question. I don't know if we have the answer. Actually, we got a bunch, but we'll answer this last one on here. Is there a good source of self-audit workbook for ISO 22301? I can answer that. Does anybody want to answer that first? No? Okay. We typically, what we'll do is we download the standard and we actually see on each of the points, in there, each of the audit points on there. What we can do is we go down and we essentially have made up our own spreadsheet. There's actually I believe when we look at it out of the genome requirements, which is basically that's 101, the ISO 22301, I believe, maps to about 35 or 36 of them. So you're not, and like I said, you're not talking about a ton of requirements in that ISO 22301. So it's a lot of things about like governance, scope, monitoring, but you'll notice in there's a lot of references to saying, hey, go to this other standard if you want to know about X or Y. For instance, there's ISO 22317, which is all about doing a BIA. So it says, hey, go to ISO 22, there's those references in there for that. IT, I believe it mentions 27001. So, I mean, it's a very referential document in doing that. 22313 has quite a bit more in there, that companion document to 22301. That's actually a particularly good one to look at. So that, if you go point by point, you can really do well. But there's nothing like like that audit program in FFIEC that, it's right in the back of the manual on there. Okay, Bob?
All right, wonderful. There are several questions, again, we did not get to today. If we did not get to them, we will follow up with you afterwards. Any parting words here, Frank and the panel?
Anybody? Well, I guess I can, on behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank everybody for their time today and actually spend an extra 5 minutes with us too. And like we said, if you have any questions at all, definitely feel free to ask us. And you can see there's a lot of other resources too on everything that we talked about today, from compliance to the genome, to risk management, to BIAs, you name it. There's probably some sort of a paper or presentation or webinar on it. So thank you again for spending an hour and 5 minutes with us today.
Wonderful. Thanks again, everyone, for their attendance here today. We again hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. DRJ would also like to thank Frank, Wayne, Mark, and Denise for their time here today, as well as Strategic BCP for sponsoring today's webinar. We will be emailing everyone a link to the recording of it as well, and you may view this recording as frequently as you wish or share it with your peers. If you do have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thanks again, and this now ends today's webinar.